Hello and welcome to the first episode of Green Garage, a show where I discuss a variety of different media that I've consumed recently. Using this format allows me to discuss shows, movies, or other kinds of entertainment that I'm interested in talking about, but that I don't have enough to say about to justify creating a video for each individual topic. First up, we have Japan Sinks, a new anime on Netflix from Devilman Crybaby director Masaki Yuasa. Masaki Yuasa has something a lot of other anime directors don't: style. When I watched the winter season's breakaway hit Keep Your Hands Off Aizuken for the first time, I had no idea who had worked on the series. However, I was able to tell immediately that Masaki Yuasa was helming the show. His characters move in such distinct ways, oftentimes displaying dramatic and sometimes horrifyingly distorted facial expressions as their mouths move in ways that defy possibility. The distinctiveness of his characters, both in physical appearance and personality, provide the bulk of enjoyment of his works for me. His characters often have bizarre quirks and distinctive principles that govern how they live their lives, which make them fun to watch. Many of Yuasa's stories revolve around some kind of uncontrollable situation, pushing against and challenging the strong principles of his characters. When I first heard that Yuasa would be helming an original show for Netflix about the entire archipelago of Japan sinking, I was excited to see just how his characters' personal principles and ways of life would be tested by what could be considered the ultimate type of challenging outside force. To my surprise, the show doesn't follow in the steps of the typical Yuasa series. Instead, Japan Sinks 2020 is a much more event-focused series, with the characters constantly in some sort of peril or in desperate need of reaching a particular location. Well, mostly, but we'll get to that later. Sure, the series wasn't quite what I expected, but for the most part it was a welcome surprise. The show kept me perpetually on the edge of my seat, as the characters were constantly subjected to new and varying kinds of danger. Part of what enables Japan Sinks to develop a sense of anxiety in the viewer is that Yuasa is not afraid to depict brutal violence when necessary. But the brutality never feels like carnage for the sake of carnage. It's to depict the realistic yet horrifying ways a person would be in danger if the entire landmass of Japan began to slowly sink. Yuasa also establishes early on that no one is safe, regardless of the role they may play in the story. And again, it focuses much more on the challenges of survival the characters experience rather than the characters themselves. So this can leave them feeling very one-note, especially for a Masaki Yuasa series. They still have their moments of development, particularly toward the end of the series. However, with one exception, I wouldn't really consider any of them to be memorable. In addition, their relationships with one another aren't always clearly defined. This can make it difficult to care when tragic things happen to them. It also makes some of the reactions they depict a bit less believable when we see them feeling sorrow for a character we've barely seen them interact with. In many ways, Japan Sinks 2020 is more akin to a brutally violent take on a traditional disaster movie where anybody can die. There's a familial relationship established at the heart of the story early on, preceding a series of sequences in which characters must find a safe place that isn't experiencing destruction on a massive scale. Well, mostly. You see, there is an arc in the middle of the series where the pacing slows dramatically. This could have been a good opportunity to learn more about the characters and to examine how this situation has impacted their relationships with one another. Instead, the series spends time during this arc focusing on new characters, as well as a possible looming mystery which have no impact on the series as a whole, apart from one character. This probably would have been more tolerable if this content was covered in one episode, which it easily could have been, but considering that it makes up 3 episodes of a 10-episode series, it has a considerable impact on the pacing of the series as a whole. In terms of the visual aspects of the show, well, they definitely won't be for everyone. While Yuasa uses the typical lanky, almost distorted character movements he typically uses in depicting the motion of his characters, the visuals in Japan Sinks seem to lack the level of polish found in many of his other works. This is most noticeable in sequences with very little movement. In these moments, characters seem to lack detail, with their faces oftentimes looking plastic-like. However, in other sequences, typically ones that are very high in movement, Yuasa's expressive faces and character animation help breathe life and energy into what may have otherwise been a boring scene. It's a show with visuals that can really be amazing or awful depending on the scene you're watching. I think that the show really works when it embraces the disaster movie underpinnings that inspired it. There are a few sentimental character moments here and there, and those are fine, but when the series, particularly near the end, tries to introduce thematic elements such as racism and whether collectivist societies are better than individualistic ones, the show falters. These themes are so rushed and crammed in near the end of the series that they feel like an afterthought, an unnecessary distraction from the story. I enjoy Japan Sinks. It contains some truly tense, edge-of-your-seat survival sequences, and the fact that basically anyone can die was a nice change of pace from the typical disaster story. This aspect of the series added an extra degree of intensity to certain scenes. However, I think the series could have been truly fantastic if it were longer. This way we could have had more time to see the characters and their relationships develop, and a slow 3-episode arc wouldn't have had such a huge impact on the momentum of the series. If the idea of a well-directed disaster movie anime excites you, then I would recommend checking Japan Sinks out. I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. Next up is Bad Education, an HBO original film starring Hugh Jackman and Allison Janney. The film chronicles the real-life story of a Long Island school district where several beloved staff members were found to have stolen millions of dollars in school funds. This movie understood something that a lot of biopics don't: the importance of pacing in a dialogue-driven film. Good pacing can be the difference between developing a film that's interesting to a viewer and one that's an absolute slog to sit through. Every scene in Bad Education presents something that keeps the viewer engaged, and a scene never lingered enough as to become drawn out or overly long. In fact, a large part of what makes Bad Education work is that the filmmakers leave out unnecessary information. There are quite a few details that are not overtly conveyed to the viewer. Instead, we are given only what's absolutely necessary for the story to be properly told. This leaves the viewer completely engaged in the experience of the film. Hugh Jackman plays the school district superintendent Frank Tizon, a man who goes out of his way to be loved by students, teachers, and faculty alike. Jackman does a wonderful job playing the hypnotic superintendent, a man who is obsessed with not only achieving the goal of making his school district #1 in the state, but with presenting himself as extremely likable and charismatic. We see him go out of his way to memorize personal information about students and faculty in order to present himself as friendly and as engaged in the lives of those around him as he possibly can. Faculty, students, and teachers all seem to love Frank and are thankful to him for the way he's run the school system. The work Frank has done has led to kids from within the school system to have a high acceptance rate at some of the best colleges in the country, and local property values have increased since Frank has become superintendent. Things begin to turn sour when we see that Pam, played very well by Allison Janney, Frank's co-worker and close friend, is budgeting her personal expenses to the school and altering the history of her transactions. When these actions of fraud come to light, we watch as Frank displays a great deal of anger and sadness toward himself and Pam. We see him express how untoward he feels it is to be stealing taxpayer dollars, and how upset he is at himself for not realizing what he was doing. For a long while, we don't know how involved Frank is in this scandal, or if he was even involved at all. Was he aware that Pam was committing acts of fraud? Has he himself also been committing acts of fraud? The film keeps the truth close to its chest, not giving moments or glimpses of Frank committing any kind of fraud. The lens of the film is from a perspective that is distant from its characters. It reveals to us the truth as it becomes apparent to the outside world, which is something that I thought to be refreshing and unique. This is a good method of keeping the viewer engaged in a mostly dialogue-driven experience. The film contains fantastic performances from Hugh Jackman, Allison Janney, and Ray Romano, with a great sense of pacing. However, despite how well it's paced and how good the actors' performances are, the film still felt hollow to me, as though the film were a bag half filled with air. The film isn't padded whatsoever, but ultimately it is a story that can be communicated in a few sentences total. This really isn't a problem with the filmmaking, more so than with the story itself. However, the issue still exists for me. The film is so simple and feels so inconsequential that I don't think I could ever see myself watching it again. The dialogue is perfectly fine, but while I see the value in trying to make a biopic as true to life as possible, I think it could have used some flair, some intensity. There's nothing in particular that stands out in Bad Education other than the performances and the way the film is paced. The film is definitely enjoyable enough to recommend as a one-time watch, but something tells me I'm not going to remember it in a few months. I'm going to give Bad Education a 6.5 out of 10.